All right, everyone. So this is a reading from Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Week 35, Who are True Christians? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ said in chapter 10 of the Gospel of St. John, "All that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." Many Christians, not surprisingly, quote this saying in condemnation of other spiritual teachers, not only the Old Testament prophets, but also Buddha, Krishna, and others who lived before Jesus, as well as, by inference, any who came after him. Yet Jesus himself said in St. Matthew chapter 5, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." Nowhere do we find Jesus condemning or even gently criticizing other spiritual masters. His criticisms were reserved for worldly attitudes and for those hypocritical Pharisees who had allowed religion to become for them a pretense. Paramhansa Yogananda explained that the expression, "all that ever came before me," referred to those spiritual teachers who placed their egos and their self-importance ahead of the Christ consciousness, in the sense of drawing people's devotion to themselves and not offering it where alone it truly belongs, to God. Yogananda himself was very firm in this regard. For example, he never spoke of anyone as his disciple. Instead, he always insisted they are God's disciples. God is the Guru, not I. Ego is a way station on the soul's journey toward enlightenment. The soul is first trapped in lower bodily forms. Slowly it evolves to the human level, at which point self-consciousness appears. Only in human form can self-consciousness transcend material form altogether, including the lower identity of ego consciousness, and discover the true divine self within. Self-consciousness manifested as ego is an incentive to deliberate self-involvement. Later in this process of development, however, the ego becomes an obstruction. Inevitably, new spiritual aspirants do not emerge effortlessly from the vortex of ego consciousness. Desire must be offered up resolutely and ever more wholeheartedly on the altar of infinity. It is a gradual process, and few even among those who seek to help others are free of ego. If, however, their motive in teaching is not to serve, but to be served, they deserve a severe reprimand, as Jesus gave them. For their direction of development is no longer upward, but downward. In the name of giving up desires, they are creating new ones. As it says in the Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter, "Desire obscures even the wisdom of the wise. Their relentless foe it is, a flame never quenched." Intellect, mind, and senses, these combined are referred to as the seat of desire. Desire through them deludes and eclipses the discrimination of the embodied soul. O Arjuna, discipline your senses, and having done so, work to destroy desire, annihilator of wisdom and of self-realization. Give God the credit for everything you do. See Him as the true doer. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om.
And now we'll continue with a reading from Whispers from Eternity. This prayer demand is number 73. Keep the compass needle of my attention ever pointing towards thee. Whether soaring through the sky encased in a steel air cage, or drawn over the land by snorting iron steeds, or moving easily over smooth highways on rubber wheels, or having my very thoughts paralyzed by the pounding din of assembly lines. The compass needle of my attention will ever keep turning toward thy magnetic North Pole of divine love. Beaten by winds of happenstance, drenched by cloudbursts of misery, sucked down in the mud of soul enmeshing ego-whipped activity, or wandering lost in jungles of confusion, my mind will yet ever reach out for thy guiding touch. The raft of my life, tossed about helplessly by the driving storms of need, was drifting toward rocks of insatiable desire. O pole star in our wisdom skies, thy twinkling light beckoned and directed me toward thy shores of eternal contentment. Though countless mechanisms pound, twist, or stretch my anguished nerves, yet will the homing pigeon of my love wing its way peacefully toward its true home in thee. So always beautiful and inspiring words by our master Yogananda. So today's talk is about who are true Christians. And this is quite controversial because the word Christian has been kidnapped by certain segments of society that think that that is only for that group that believes in Jesus Christ. But truth is universal. There is no such thing as a true Christian vision from which anyone else belonging to another religion or tradition is excluded. A true Christian is a lover of God, regardless of their ethnicity, their background, religion, race. A lover of God is a true Christian. If we break down the word Christian, we can see Christ, I am. That is the word that comprises that state of being established in the Christ consciousness. Once Swami Kriyananda was visiting the Holy Land, and a man came up to him and said, "Do you believe Jesus Christ died for our sins?" And Swami very calmly looked at the gentleman and said, "How can God die?" So this gentleman was rendered speechless by that answer. But isn't that true? When we get all wrapped up in dogma, it has to be this way. It becomes so confined, so controlling, so small. We go down into rabbit holes and farther away from the truth. In our reading today, we heard Jesus say that all that came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. The thieves and robbers are those who want to insert themselves, position themselves in front of that state of Christ consciousness. And I imagine that all good preachers and spiritual teachers start out with good intentions, but sometimes their actions are a little bit misguided after they stand in front of their pulpits and have their adoring audiences think wonders of them. They go off on a tangent and they forget who they are truly serving. Masters tells of a story of a church, of a gentleman who was in a church in some southern state. And it was during the time of segregation, and in that church there were only white people who were allowed in to worship on Sundays. And this gentleman, his name was Jim, he was a black janitor, and he just wanted to worship on Sunday. He felt the magnetism inside that church, and he wanted to be part of it. He wanted to pray to God together with all his other brothers and sisters, but because he was black, he was not allowed in. So one night, Jim prayed wholeheartedly to God, to Jesus. He says, Jesus, why can't I go into that church and pray and honor you and worship you with the white folk? And he went to sleep. And during his dream, he had a vision in which Jesus appeared to him. And he said, Jim, don't worry. I've been trying to get into that church for the past 20 years myself, and I have yet to succeed. So those that are established in the real Christ consciousness, those are the people that live immaculate lives, not good lives, immaculate lives, pure lives, impeccable lives. Those are the saints. And those people are very quiet. People who are awake are extremely quiet, sometimes almost invisible. Yogananda was very quiet when he was with his monks and nuns. When he was with newcomers, he was very loquacious and hospitable, and he used to tell jokes, and people found him extremely entertaining. But for those who knew where it was at, only silence reigned. And Swami, when he was a young monk, just yearned to get close to Yogananda, to ask him questions and to have his questions developed and articulated in answers. And Yogananda broke that habit. He realized that when he was close to Master, his questions somewhat dissolved. There was no issue. All that intellectual aspect was absorbed into something much greater that you always had when you were in the presence of a master. Yogananda never spoke of himself as the Guru. He always said, God's the Guru. The disciples all belong to God. And even though he was a great master and he performed many, many miracles, he was very quiet and silent about it. There was once a female devotee who was very ill, and people were praying for her. There was a prayer circle. I believe Yogananda was not in the place where this devotee was, but he prayed for her too, and the devotee passed. But after a while, she came back to life. And Dr. Lewis asked Yogananda later in passing, did you have anything to do with that woman regaining her life? He said, I just did what Divine Mother asked me to. That was it. And he only answered Dr. Lewis's question. He did not further any more information. And this is what Dr. Lewis experienced, and there are many other miracles that his close devotees experienced and spoke about. This is what we've heard. But what has happened that we haven't heard? How much has the Master done? And it's gone silent. That's the true lover of God, a devotee, established in that state of God consciousness. And how do we come close to that state? Well, first, through attunement to the Guru. That's the whole purpose of the Guru. Coming down to lay a little step so we can step on that. And then another step when we're ready. And then another and another, until we reach that state of being anchored in the Christ consciousness. When you're in that state of wholeness, you look forward to your practice. You look forward to your sadhana. Your sadhana is a joy. You crave it. You couldn't think of going without it. You want to be in that state. But when you're not in that state, everything else becomes a chore, including our spiritual practice. There's a story about a Native American Indian who was a farmer who lived next to another very wealthy farmer next door. And the wealthy farmer came and told him, you know, it pains me to see you working so hard on that tiny little quarter acre of yours. And I've been blessed with so much property. Let me give you some of my property so you can cultivate that land and you can feed your family well. And the Native American Indian was very appreciative of this very generous offer from his neighbor, but he answered, "Sir, I'm very grateful at your generous offer, but you see, I'm perfectly content with what God has given me. If I had more land to cultivate and farm, when would I find the time for singing? Are we content with the circumstances that the Lord has placed in our lives? Are we still singing? It's hard to sing sometimes, isn't it? Your circumstances as they are just perfect. So many factors came into play to place you exactly where you are so you could sing. Because your circumstances are there for the highest evolution and unfoldment of your soul. Sometimes it's hard to sing, but we have to sing. Even if we're going through a pleasantly good time, we also sing. Whereas Yogananda says, we never know when a karmic bomb might detonate in our lives. So spiritual warriors, we sing in battle and we sing during the good times. We never stop singing. We never stop our practice. We're always attuned with the Lord. And that relationship with God, that attunement, being in contact with the divine God consciousness is our ticket to salvation. That's the only way we will live a life that is filled with grace and victory, regardless of what comes down the pike for us. And what is it that has kept all these major religions going through life, whether it be Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Judaism? It's not the priests, the rabbis, the imams. It's those saints that have held the true divine consciousness in their hearts, that have lived for God moment to moment, step by step. Those are the ones that hold the flame of the divine presence in our lives. There's a story of a young woman named Catherina Sordini. She was born in Italy in the 1770s, I believe, to a very wealthy family, and the family was deeply religious, deeply Catholic at that time in Italy. Most people were Catholic. And she was a bit of a wild spirit. She loved sitting on the rocks next to the ocean and looking up at the stars and wondering about life in the universe. But at the age of about 17 or 18, her father decided it was time for her to marry. So he picked out a suitor. And she wasn't too crazy about it. She was like, no, Dad, this is not for me. You know, I don't think I want this calling right now. You know, marriage, I would feel confined. But the father said, think about it. And so she did. And eventually she wanted to comply with her father's wishes. So she said, fine, I will be offered an engagement to this gentleman. And of course, the suitor offered her a chest of jewels, of diamonds and gems and pearls and what have you, to show his seriousness and his strong backing to maintain her through life. So she was in a room and she opened the chest of jewels and she put on all her earrings and adorned herself beautifully from head to toe and turned to the mirror to admire herself. And in the reflection of the mirror, she saw the image of the crucified Christ, who looked at her and said, Are you leaving me for another? So with that question, she decided to take off the jewels. That put a damper on the plans for engagement. She went to a convent and entered a convent as a sister. While she was there, soon after entering the convent, she started having apparitions of Jesus that was telling her he wanted her to start an order to allow people, sisters, to pray incessantly day and night, to be adorers, to humbly adore the Lord. So she told her superiors, well, look what's happening. You know, I'm getting some visitations from Jesus. And of course they didn't like it. They thought, you know, that's just, she's just trying to grab attention and put her down and didn't pay attention. But she kept telling her superior, you know, I have these visitations of Jesus and Jesus is telling me all this. They said, well, why don't you put it on paper? You just do that. Go and take down, make annotations of everything Jesus is telling you. And so she did. So the weeks, months went by, and she handed a manuscript of about 200 pages to her superiors. And one day she was raking leaves on the grounds of the convent, dry leaves, and she had made a fire and they were burning. She was burning the leaves in the fire when one of the priests appeared. One of the priests that didn't believe her and gave her a hard time and couldn't believe that Jesus was talking to her, not to him. So he took out the manuscript and he said, how many of these have you made? She says, that's the only one. That's the original. That's what I was asked to do, to write everything Jesus told me and to hand it over. And he says, well, this is what I think about all these manuscripts. And he threw it into the flames. And the sister, at that time now, her name was Sister Mary Magdalene of the Incarnation. She had taken that spiritual name. She didn't flinch. She just kept adding leaves to the fire and seeing all those papers go up in smoke. So the priest said, if Jesus spoke to you once, he'd probably speak to you twice. So why don't you go back and write that again, if that is so true? And so she did. She went back, and over the months, she put together another manuscript, 200 pages. She handed over to the priest. Now the priest became a believer because initially he had tricked her. What he threw into the fire were just other pages. He kept the original manuscript to compare it with a second manuscript, word per word. Not one was altered, not one was missing. So then he became a believer that maybe Jesus did talk to this young nun. Anyways, she eventually started her own order, and she became the abbess of the order that she started. And there was a comment by one of the popes, Pope John 23rd, that said, and I wrote it down somewhere, because he was impressed by her, by the life of this sister, and by the life of many other sisters who have lived these saintly lives. He said, the cloistered sister adoring before the tabernacle is a most effective representative of mankind. And I'd like to add to that, because this statement does not only pertain to a monastic in robes. And to be cloistered means to be in seclusion. And seclusion doesn't mean you're in a mountain cave in the Himalayas, or you're in a cell in a monastery. Seclusion means that only God lives within. That is the only guest. You're always in seclusion when you are in attune with that divine presence. And the tabernacle is a place where in Catholicism they keep the hosts, but originally it comes from the Latin word tabernaculum, which meant tent or hut, which were structures that were dedicated for people to go and worship. So that place of worship for the yogi is the altar of the heart. That is a tabernacle. So anybody who is in that state of divine attunement, of divine consciousness, is the most effective representative of mankind. And that is the true Christian. In this state, we are in this fortress, in this plenitude. Nothing penetrates this state of being where we are anchored in God. And yet, what did Krishna tell Arjuna? Desire, delusion. Control your senses. Because even though you're in that state, you can be drawn out. Desire is an affirmation of lack. And how many people have gone off the path by the desire to seek something that they thought would bring them fulfillment? They've left the path for incarnations, for maybe a lifetime, maybe years, maybe months, maybe weeks, minutes. We wage the battle to be in the divine presence, moment to moment, and breath by breath. The moment you forget God, you've gone off into delusion. That moment of remembrance, you return to that fortress, to that tabernacle. You're back in the heart of infinity. But how do we remain anchored in that state? Well, we're not doing it alone. We're here working with the Buddha's blessings. God's grace is with us. We're not doing this alone, ever. And like Master used to tell us monks, be in tune, be in tune, always be in tune, especially when I leave this planet. Be in tune and you will be safe. And even if you do have a desire, give it up to God. It's His show anyways. Even the ugliest, awfulest desire or the most beautiful desire, offer it up to God. Because all desires will take us off on a tangent and will hand us disillusionment. It's set up to be that way. We will be disillusioned, except for the one desire to want God. That's the only desire that will never, ever disappoint you. For this desire will give us what we've always been seeking, that ultimate happiness in God.